Jamie, tell me about the sex research.
Yeah. That was an extended aside.
This has been one long podcast tease.
Yeah, there we go. Isn't that appropriate? Right? So all hopped up and no place to go. So where we left off that thread was basically saying, hey, human sexuality is hardwired to our deepest evolutionarily encoded both pleasure networks and autonomic nervous system.
Yeah.
And then you're like, okay, that would make sense if we can use that to help healing, inspiration, and connection. And we're obviously lacking in all of those these days. But the real insights I had was I was giving a talk at the Battery Club up in San Francisco, and it was with Rick Doblin from MAPS and our friend Jason Silva. And the three of us were on stage, and we were just kind of riffing on the future of psychedelic culture, blah, blah, blah. And then in a sort of set break in between, I was like, so Rick, how's it going? Catch me up on the phase 2 trials. How's it going? And he's like, yeah, as a matter of fact, what we've been finding are we've been doing like neurochemical assessments as to what's happening for these people who are engaging in the MDMA therapy who have suffered from PTSD.
Yeah.
And what we're noticing is a couple of things. One is that memories are actually turning out to be pretty plastic, fluid, right? And it's not just a fixed thing like a memory of past trauma. You can take them off the shelf. You can talk about them, you can work with them, and then you can put them back on a different shelf. And you are actually different, and your past is actually different as a result. And the neurophysiological correlates of that is like high vasopressin, high oxytocin, high prolactin. And he goes, and one of our researchers, like the closest correlate or analog we can find to that is the post-orgasmic state. And I was like, what? Are you kidding me?
Well, what's super dope is in like my practices and like the Vita methodology, it's all developed so that people do personal transformation while they're doing pleasure practices and having orgasm experiences because their nervous system is more plastic during that time. Like it's more malleable, and the transformation gets accelerated when you're literally doing transformational processes while you're in a heightened state of pleasure and erotic activation.
Yeah, exactly. And while that could be sort of, dismissed or not, because people think, oh, that's just bullshit New Age Tantra stuff. Like this was actually, empirical validation of like, hey, the same neurochemicals, you just get them from a pill that happens to be Schedule 1 and tightly controlled for now and increasingly accessible, but for a long, long, long time, tightly controlled, accessible, or straight up illegal and underground. You're like, oh my gosh, if everybody has the capacity to be in or near a post-orgasmic state, and that can lead to radical and empirically validated healing, that's worth paying attention to. And so that was my first kind of like breadcrumb down the rabbit hole.
Also without a hangover, because like you can only do MDMA so much, right?
Yeah, it's
but you can have as many orgasms
system
as you want. So
well, the MDMA is methamphetamine. Let's not forget, kids.
Totally.
It's gnarly and hard on a nervous system and your neurochemistry. Yeah. And so that led me to come across Dr. Nicole Prousey's work, and she was a sort of wunderkind researcher at the Kinsey Institute, the obviously well-known sexual institute study. She did her postdoc at Harvard. She was then at UCLA, and she's been researching orgasm as prescription effectively, specifically for women, and just the ideas of, can it cure anxiety? Can it help alleviate insomnia, physical pain, any inflammatory diseases, all of these things. And she's gone as far as basically saying, hey, look, even a bunch of sex health researchers actually subtly shame people. Like if I come home after a hard day at work and I masturbate and have an orgasm, that's poor coping skills, and you need to figure out something else to do, play video games or go golf.
Totally. People shame me as a Tantra teacher. I'm like, have a 5-minute orgasm as much as you want. Like stressed out during work, like fucking lock the bathroom door, get on the floor. I like love to have an orgasm on my closet floor, like on a regular basis. And it's sort of like, why are you coping? It's like you're like taking a swig of vodka or whatever. And you're like, no, it actually like buoys your nervous system in this like, it feels like an ocean of love and pleasure, which is probably just like prolactin, dopamine, all the things,
Yeah. And so, you put those two together and throw in Helen Fisher's research, who was also, she's an alumna of Kinsey, but then the chief scientist for Match.com, who's done tons of research on, both the 3 stages of, lust, attraction, and bonding, and then also the neurochemistry of our sexual arousal patterns and how that correlates to how we engage the rest of our life. All of that kind of work, you're like, wow, okay, these are really long levers. Yeah. This is cheap to free, obviously, super accessible. Not repressible either. Like we all have possession of our bodies, at least for the most part, right? Except in extreme instances, of denial. And
totally.
Right. And
although it's still so hard, right? That's what I tell people, like, isn't it wild that even in the privacy of your own bedroom, your asshole still feels like a huge issue. Like it's a portal to God, and it's still like, you know, you can't just easily take off all that cultural conditioning and repression the moment you enter your bedroom. It comes with you.
Yeah, for sure.
Unless you get rid of it.
Well, and then the simplest is, you know, to get into the research that we then did, because I mean, I did this initial lab, and I'm like, wait, it definitely seems like there's a there, and it seems like there's some empirical validation, and one of Nicole's final studies was also on fundamentally on orgasmic meditation. So 15 minutes of clitoral stroking, and does that, you know, and how does that stack up? How does that stack up to the Johns Hopkins studies on mystical experience and psilocybin studies and all of those things? And, you know, sure enough, it did show up, as you mentioned earlier, on being able to produce comparable mystical states according to the MEQ30, which is the sort of gold standard mystical experience questionnaire, as psilocybin, and then in the peakest states and the highest states actually even higher than the psilocybin. And so you're like, okay, so wait, so we've correlated that from the MAPS MDMA therapy, the neurochemistry is the same as orgasm or post-orgasm. And we've also correlated that, you know, in a different distinct study, that having those orgasms can produce mystical states. So we've got a physiological bit and a psychological bit, and you put them together and they're the tits. You're like, yes, this is absolutely fantastic stuff. So now what would it look like to put these together into integrated protocols? And that's where we ran a 12-week study with 10 couples to basically have them combine these things, but then let's measure it, because obviously everything you just said, there's so much shame, there's so much guilt, there's so much social stuff, there's so much repression, there's so much squirreliness on the relational, psychological, like it's a minefield, right? Human sexuality is a goddamn minefield, and it's a thankless job to get anywhere near it. So I really I was like, I don't want to do this, but if we're gonna, let's do it right. And let's figure out, okay, is this increasing access to peak states? Is this helping you connect better to your partner, making more love, right? And is this helping us relieve or alleviate trauma? And then took 2 benchmark metrics off the shelf. So they're out there, they're used in other studies, so they can talk, the research and the findings can talk to each other. And we used a flow state scale, like how in the moment do I feel day to day, the same mystical experience questionnaire for the peak states, so we could track that. Then for connection, we did the intimacy of self and other scale, which you are probably familiar with, which is just a series of Venn circles. How close and overlapped do we feel from like we are one to we don't touch, right? And you can just kind of look at them and couples can point. And then the PANAS scale, the positive and negative affect scale. So like, how stoked am I to be in this relationship, living my life right now? So that was the relational one. And then the final one was trauma. And we did basically the PCL5 scale, which is the do-it-yourself trauma scale. The CAPS trauma scale is the gold standard, but that's with a therapist and an interview, and too costly for us to scale out. And then also baseline HRV. So the idea of like, okay, the PCL5 scale, that will tell me about my historic trauma, the big hits, childhood abuse, adverse life events. But day to day, how fucked up is my nervous system versus defragged? And so the overnight resting heart rate variability is a good metric of that. And what we found over that 12 weeks was that, interestingly, women had the highest delta and variance. They started out coming in with holding more trauma, but they had a bigger healing and amending, both in their relationship to their historic adverse life events as well as their week to week physiology. And that the couples experienced increased closeness, which I wasn't actually super surprised by that, because you're doing a dedicated 12-week program to be closer. So you're kind of like, okay, that's a correlation causation kind of thing. But the peak states were also exceeded the psilocybin states, and many subjective reports where these were some of the most profound non-ordinary states I've had in my life. So basically everything went up high and to the right, and it went higher and more to the right than regular conventional talk therapy and even therapist assisted psychedelic therapy. So you're like, wait, we can do this at home by ourselves for ourselves, and we can experience the most healing, inspiration, and connection we ever have in our lives. Seemed like a worthwhile outcome. And what it felt like was it was a continuum, right? So the first half of the practices were basically delivering what I would sort of call sexual fitness, right? All you're doing is thinking about all the normal things that people would do. And that could be body work. That could be myofascial stuff. That could be breath work. That could be mindfulness. You could take a pick of all the good things you can possibly do and then simply add partner-based sexual arousal and stimulation.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's just more, basically like twice as much, you know? So just think again, like it became what some participants called sort of a sexual yoga of becoming. And then the second half is if you increase that, intensify it, and then really turn it all up to 11, then you get into non-ordinary states, mystical states, transpersonal states. And it's very much just kind of a sliding scale. If you're starting, you're just sticking to the basics and you're kind of just you're flossing your teeth version. It's going to help me defrag my nervous system on a daily basis. It's going to keep me more primed and saturated with the happy neurochemical cascade versus the agitated sympathetic neurochemical cascade. Good for you. 100% beneficial and worthwhile. And if that's as far as you want to take it, awesome. Do that. And on the other hand, if you want to keep going in that journey, it can lead all the way to the doorstep of what has only ever been described in esoteric wisdom traditions.